In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about well-being and its connection to individual differences. I'm going to dive deep into personality and provide a brief overview on personality. Then I'm going to talk specifically about a couple traits and a little bit about some constituents and how there's these mind-body environment constituencies that are formed very much in personality. And oftentimes, what you'll see within personality philosophy, personality psychology, even personality neuroscience and biology, and across personality studies within the mind sciences, you'll see that to study personality, often what happens is we break things down into constituents or facets of personality, and then there's branches of those that form these constituencies that make things like personality traits or these various components that we study in personality, of these various constructs that are composed of perception, motivation, emotion, feeling, action, and behavior. And those constituents form these constituencies. And then oftentimes, too, what you'll see in various disciplines, such as personality psychology, there's constituents across discipline and constituencies that are formed. So there's various psychobiological theories, psychosocial theories, psychosocial biological theories that have a basis in neuroscience, and there's a psychophysiology to that. And we've discussed a little bit, I've discussed a little bit about that in previous videos, such as perception-dependent learning plasticity, which has an underlying biology to it within neuroplasticity, plasticity referring to the degree of change and development or flexibility that's occurring. And that happens on a perceptual level with that learning plasticity, as well as a neurological level that's going on in the nervous system, reflected in neurons and changes in nervous activity and the pathways of activity in various processes in the body, regulating various functions that support our well-being. And I just want to give a brief overview of personality. And personality is often measured in these various traits that are formed by, in traditional theory, it has been thought of more as thought, thinking, emotional processes, and behavior. But we can think about it more broadly, including things like perception, motivation, action, behavior, emotion, and feelings. These are all contained within personality, and they form somewhat different constituencies. And when we're thinking about personality, this is very important, understanding various concepts such as individuality and the self, and also importantly, what impacts our well-being and what uniquely impacts our well-being. These differences within our meaning perception, what we're motivated by is uniquely meaningful to us as individuals. Our unique various differences in emotional expression, our unique feelings that we might have across different situations where others might not feel the same, our unique actions or behaviors that we might express across situations that others might not, but that we also do with some degree of consistency or elasticity. And I want to talk also slightly about these three overarching principles too of consistency, elasticity, and plasticity. And consistency has more to do with whether or not the personality stays stable across various situations or is consistent across situations. This helps to give personality structure. It helps to also define it and operationally define it, but personality is very dynamical, and so we have elasticity in there that very much connects consistency with plasticity. And what elasticity is, it very much you can think of, you might exhibit a certain set or express various processes, expressions, self-expressions, or even embodiments when you're in your leisure time, maybe hanging out with friends like a peer group, or when you're by yourself in solitude, or even just chilling out at home. And then when you go, say, to work or school, you have this like almost a different personality, but it's consistent. Like they're both consistent and they're both you. They can both be authentic expressions of the self. They're just activating different aspects of personality, and they're very much related to the situated self. But they're structures of personality. And what's going on there is there's some elasticity there in personality. It's very much connecting the consistency with the plasticity. And this takes us to the plasticity end of personality, which has to do with things like change and development, particularly things like learning and engaging in these learning processes, as well as adaptability. So the degree of change that our personality grows in. Not just change, there's development too. So it has an element of consistency there too, and elasticity. And one of the great personality psychologists, Brian Little, he talks about the rubber band of personality. So we can change to some degree, but we can't change too much. Otherwise, there's a snap back. And this very much shows that link between elasticity and plasticity, which is important, highly important for positive well-being and connecting with the meaning that's related central to the self. And there's various constituents that are formed on a perceptual, a psychological, and a neurobiological level that are associated with that. And you see this, like for example, there are certain personality dimensions associated with positive emotions, such as within extroverts and or within the measures of extroversion and within the measures of particularly emotional stability. But there's also emotional aspects, a lot of dimensions also associated with openness to experience, as well as agreeableness and honesty, humility, and to some degree conscientiousness. But a lot of the emotion research will be focused in one category or two, like a couple of categories. So you'll have like a lot of research on positive emotion focused, say, on extroverts, and a lot of research focused on, say, negative emotions, the regulation of negative emotions, on emotional stability. But there's a plethora of, particularly, like I like to think about it as more intellectually or imaginatively stimulating emotions and feelings, more of these internal emotions that are associated with trait openness and openness to experience, that has to do with things like interest, has to do with meaning cultivation, the positive emotions that we might experience during, and like even enthusiasm is associated. So you see it predominantly associated with extroversion, but individuals who are, say, introverted and highly open will experience enthusiasm over ideas that interest them and philosophical interests, rather than a general expression of enthusiasm towards, for example, other individuals, or particularly reward, various types of reward, and risk in reward too. That's highly important because extroversion is more associated with the behavioral activation system and an individual's willingness to approach risky or stressful situations, and often social situations that are highly stimulating, that have a lot of things going on. They're able to tolerate to some degree a high amount of stimulation within the environment, and within the self. Where introverts tend to want to focus, and they try to lower the amount of stimulation so they can hone in on particular stimuli in the environment rather than a large amount of environmental stimulation, which has to do with lower levels of behavioral activation. And this is reflected in various brain regions in the brain. So you have, for example, in the behavioral activation system, the reward networks of the brain associated with the prefrontal cortex, and then you have this ventral striatum, which has a lot of these dopamine projections, and there's dopamine receptors and projections in the prefrontal cortex that are also linked to the nucleus accumbens. And then you also have some connections with the anterior cingulate, so the self, which are important for reinforcing learning and various processes associated with higher order cognitions and approaching reward, and also managing risk. But then in highly open individuals, you'll see in the medial prefrontal cortex, there's these similar dopamine projections associated primarily with things like interest, and that's connected also to the ventral striatum and the anterior cingulate, again associated with the self. But it's not as it's a little bit of a different constituency, right? And it's more associated with this internal processing, what individuals find interesting. And you'll see these when we're looking at things like perception, motivation, emotion, feeling, action, and behavior across a particular domain of personality, there are these different constituencies there are occurring within that psychological dimension and also impacting a psychophysiological dimension, um, which reflects that underlying neuroscience that's going on there too. So, for example, with an emotional stability and things like self-regulation, you'll see the HPA axis often connected with areas of the frontal region of the brain, such as, say, the executive function, which will link us more to traits like conscientiousness, and that's association with emotional stability. And or we can just see, like, hone in on emotional stability and see the activation of the hippocampus associated with memory, amygdala associated with more of our stress and negative emotion responses in general, as well as the anterior cingulate and the insula. The insula is associated with pain. The anterior cingulate is also associated with the self. So you'll see in terms of self-regulation within emotional stability and being able to have develop greater emotional intelligence or self-intelligence. Uh, Often, what's going on here is there's those become uh, interconnected. So you might have a negative emotion, so you have high activation in the amygdala and a lot of coding in the hippocampus, and then and also a pain response in the anterior cingulate. Then you'll see this top down or this medial prefrontal projection that's influencing that and regulating that, and eventually will decrease the activity in the amygdala and decrease the activity in the amygdala in terms of its frequency, which is associated with lowering the frequency of negative emotion, which has to do more with as we develop this self intelligence and an awareness of our emotions. These projections start to make more of these connections to the frontal regions of our brain associated more with that executive functioning, as well as higher order thinking, or just even the medial prefrontal cortex that has to do more with learning and processing our interests. um, and it has more to do with this perceptual process of regulation that's occurring at a top-down level on a bottom-up response. A bottom-up response typically associated with psychological distress that ceases to become distress and turns more into this eustress or a positive stressful state that can positively benefit our well-being and positively benefit us across producing things like positive perceptions, positive motivations, positive emotions, positive feelings, positive actions, and positive behaviors. And um, the frequency in which we'll experience various different perceptions is going to depend largely upon our individual differences in terms of personality. And this impacts the self, and this impacts our well-being directly, and also can help guide us and cultivate a greater understanding in that self-intelligence through understanding our unique personality traits, through building an awareness and recognition of them within the self, um, which is really good for cultivating positive well-being, but also this um, positive psychologically sustainable wellness infrastructure. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and that's all I'm going to say for now on that. And I'll discuss these topics going forward in a little bit more depth in videos upcoming.